We all know that writers make use of imagery, but how does it affect the meaning of a text? What does it do to a text? Why do they use imagery? Especially in poetry, of course, it abounds in poetry, but also in other writing. So, if we look at imagery and ask ourselves why it's used, the main thing we can say about it perhaps is that it illuminates writing. It brightens it up. It makes it more beautiful, more accessible, and it creates the idea, because it creates pictures in words, it grabs the reader, and the reader feels with the writer what these images mean, and what the effect um, would be on the text. So it is basically, it's pictures described in words. It's not necessarily figures of speech. It can be descriptive writing that create little pictures in our heads. The main thing about it is that they appeal to our senses. And that is what we're going to explore. And the senses, of course, we're talking about the senses of the reader. So, in other words, we have a certain number of senses, and we all have that in common. So, in other words, if it appeals to our senses, it's going to affect how we react to the text, and it makes the writing more vivid. It makes it more meaningful. Let us have a look at these senses that we have. Some words or descriptions might appeal to our visual sense, our sense of seeing. Some to the auditory sense, or our sense of hearing. Might be words with onomatopoeic effects. Some to the tactile sense. We all know that sometimes we know what it feels like to feel plastic, for instance, as opposed to velvet or silk. It has a different feel to it. Even a blind person can sense that difference. So your tactile touch is sense is the touch sense. In other words, what goes through your head? What do you sense when you feel something? Your olfactory sense is your sense of smelling. You have a gustatory sense. It is a sense of taste. Sometimes in a good recipe, if it's properly explained, it might give you the idea of how scrumptious the dish is. Then we've got the kinesthetic sense. It's a sense of movement. Now, the sense of movement has to do with your body movement. In other words, your body knows what happens, for instance, when you move. What is the position of your arm as opposed to where the position of your leg is? For instance, when you're riding a bicycle, there are receptors, and the information is sent to your brain, and you know how to ride a bicycle, although you don't actually know what you're doing. You don't ask yourself, what exactly am I doing right now? Your body just gives you the feeling, right? So eventually it is about your sense of movement. So look at a few examples, and we're going to ask ourselves whether we can identify which of the senses are being appealed to right now. He rasped his beard with his thumb. Now, rasping is really something that you hear, but it's also perhaps a tactile idea. The person sits and he rasps his beard with his thumb, and you might hear something in the process, but also you can get the idea of what it feels like when he rasps his thumb, at the beard with his thumb. So it has to do with a sense of hearing and the sense of touch, the tactile sense. In the sentence, it was dark, dim, and gloomy in the old house. You can see that we are talking about a visual sense here, the darkness, the dimness, the gloominess. Children were screaming and yelling. It's your sense of hearing, your auditory sense. He whiffed the aroma. It's a sense of smell. The aroma is something that you smell. She ran her hands over the velvet. It's a tactile sense. And once again, the enticing aroma that wafts through the house is something that you will smell. And the dish that is creamy and spicy will appeal to your gustatory sense. Look at the following. Here is a description that appeals to the reader's senses. The glasses clinked, knives and forks clattered, and the wine bottles glugged as we processed through the meal. But these words, clinked, clattered, and glutted, all appeal to our sense of hearing. Look at this one, for instance. This is an interesting one. Both these extracts are from My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. I succeeded at last in getting a grip on Aleko's beak, and I hauled him in, screaming and flapping out from under the table. I was hot and dishevelled by the time I had pinioned his wings and carried him back to his cage. So we've definitely got an idea of a tactile sense here. He was grabbing, he's getting a grip on it. But also, can you get the feeling that if you are sort of trying to catch, say, for instance, a dove or a bird, and the bird is wriggling under your hands, you also get that idea of kinesthetic sense of the movement that's happening under your hands, and how your arms, the stretching and the pulling back of your muscles, how that feels. So you've got the kinesthetic sense here, and you've got the sense of touch, the tactile sense here, the flapping and the screaming. Screaming here, the sense of hearing, the flapping, it's the visual. So can you see how this little part comes alive to us because the author has engaged our senses? So let's read it again. I succeeded at last in getting a grip on Aleko's beak, and I hauled him screaming and flapping out from under the table. I was hot and dishevelled by the time I had pinioned his wings and carried him back to the cage. We can see it before us because of the senses that were awakened here in our heads. Imagery, of course, is used in figures of speech. And it becomes very clear to us if we have the one thing compared, for instance, to another, and we can see the picture in our heads. It becomes very clear. But our senses here too are being referred to. So here is a little part from Romeo and Juliet. Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. So we might get this picture of the burning torches, and we hear the description of Romeo saying, but she is even brighter than those torches. So it gives us the idea of how radiant she is, etc. So it creates that sense of comparison, but also it involves our sense of seeing, of the visual sense, and sometimes, of course, of hearing and so forth. So in imagery then, but sometimes the imagery used is not necessarily like a figure of speech, like a comparison in a metaphor or in a simile. It is just the way something is described, and the mere fact that it appeals to your senses makes it imagery, because we can see it in front of our eyes. My sorrow, when she's here with me, thinks these dark days of autumn rain are beautiful as days can be. She loves the bare, the withered tree. She walked the sodden pasture lane. We do have a figure of speech here. We've got personification, The writer personifies his own sorrow. So, what he's saying is, on days when I feel sad, this is how I see the countryside. This is how I experience the world outside. It's dark days. It affects my sense of seeing, my visual sense. He talks about autumn rain. You can virtually feel it. It's a tactile thing, and it's perhaps something that you can hear, but it involves your senses, and it's beautiful. He says, as days can be. And he talks about the bear, it's a visual sense, the bear, the withered tree, and then the sodden pasture. It's a sense of feeling. You can feel the sodden, the wetness of the pastures. So it involves your senses, and it makes you experience the scene, the way in which the author sees it. We've looked at various ways in which our senses can be involved and how it creates within us a certain picture of the text involved. So it does affect the reader, it affects the mood. The one thing that I'd like you just to perhaps remember today is the kinesthetic sense that we don't often hear about. We often think we just have a sense of seeing, of hearing, etc., and of smelling. But the kinesthetic sense is a sense that you need to explore a little bit, especially in your writing as well. Because if you, for instance, describe a sports match, or you describe something horrific that's happening, or a very tense moment where you become so aware of your body and your movements, how your legs are moving, your arms are moving. And even though you can't see, it might be dark because you're relying on your prior knowledge of the place and how you're feeling things, your muscles contracting and so forth. It's a sense that's very, very effective to use when you are doing those kinds of descriptions. Think, for instance, of a chess, a game of chess, for instance, or, as I say, any sports that you do. Try and practice using that sense in addition to the other senses that you use in your writing.